Because the lecture material and the videos are a little more sparse for Chapter 4, I thought I'd talk through some of the topics. The first one I'm going to talk through is the while loop from Chapter 4, and we'll have some other videos later where we go through some of the other topics. Okay, so some of the topics we discuss in Chapter 4, we're going to talk about increment and decrement operators, which are very useful within loops. We'll talk about that. The while loop, which we'll talk about in this video. And then there's a couple other types of loops. There's a do while loop and a for loop. We'll talk about the distinctions between those in some other videos as well. So first we have the increment and decrement operators. Quite often in a loop, you will be wanting to go through a list or a series of numbers, and you want to keep track of how many times you've gone through the loop. A simple way to do that is to have a number that is going up each time you go through the loop. And a typical way to do that in programming is the top couple lines you see there. You have a variable called number, and you might say number equals number plus 1. So if the number before the statement was the number 1, after the statement number equals number plus 1 is executed, that number would increment or go up 1 to 2. Similarly, decrement is just the opposite. So if you have a number 2 and then you apply number equal number minus 1, that number would go from 2 down to 1. And this is a way when we're running through loops to keep track of how many times we've gone through the loop. It's used all the time. So there's also a shorthand that Java provides to increment and decrement, and you'll notice this in other languages as well. Java is actually very similar in some ways to C or C++ or C# if you guys have used any of those languages. Even JavaScript has a lot of syntax that's very similar. So instead of using the longhand of number equal number plus 1, you can see down at the bottom of the page we could do number plus plus or plus plus number, and that allows us to actually increment the number. Same thing with number minus minus or minus minus number. That allows us to decrement or decrease the number. So it's just a shorthand way to do an operation that's very common within loops. Okay, so first we have the most common loop, the while loop. It can be used in a variety of different contexts. We have maybe a statement like we want the user to enter in their password. So we could say while the password is not equal to the stored password, they need to keep going through this while loop. So it goes in, they enter their password, it checks the password. If the passwords are not what the recorded password is, then it prompts them to do it again, and it will just keep them in that loop until they enter it correctly. So just a simple example of why you may want to use a while loop. So while the condition is true, whatever the condition may be in the while loop, the statements continue to execute repeatedly. And we have this concept of pretest, which means that when is the condition tested? In the while loop, it's a pretest loop, which means that the condition is tested prior to executing the loop. Which means that if the condition is false, the loop won't execute at all. The do while loop, which we'll talk about in a bit, is actually another kind which allows the condition to be tested after the loop has gone through one time. And obviously, when we're doing a while loop, we have to make sure that at some point we set the condition to false so that the loop will end. Otherwise, we end up with infinite loops, which is something that I'm sure you will, if you have not yet, experience as a programmer, and it will cause your program to crash. So a simple flow chart. We basically have our test on the left, a Boolean. We have an expression like is password equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If it's true, or excuse me, is the password not equal to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? If that statement is true, it will keep going through the while loop. As soon as that is false, when the person correctly enters the password, then we would exit the while loop. So again, we have to make sure the condition becomes false. In this case, we have a while loop that's an infinite loop. So we start out with a variable x of 20, and while x is greater than 0, we're going to print x is greater than 0. But you can see that we never reset the value of x within the loop. And so every single time the while loop evaluates, x is 20. We got a problem. So that loop is going to execute, and it's going to print out x is greater than 0 forever until the program crashes. So that's a problem. Okay, so if we were to add x minus minus, which if we remember from a previous slide is the decrement, that will fix the problem because it will actually change the value of x such that it will go down. Now if we would have said x plus plus, that's going to be a problem because x will always be greater than 0. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take that loop, we're going to add our decrement value, x minus minus. The loop will go through 20 times until the value of x is 0. When the value of x is 1, it's going to go through the loop because 1 is greater than 0. When the value of x is 0, it's no longer greater than 0, and so it will then exit the loop. So that's a quick summary of the first part of Chapter 4 on while loops. I will post another video going through some of the other material, the do loops and the for loops, a little bit later. Thanks a lot, guys, and talk to you soon. Again, if you guys have questions about the problems you're working on, feel free to email me. I try to do my best to get back to each of you in a timely way. Thanks again.